Biker slaps 85-year-old veteran in diner. Then his son arrives with an entire military unit. He walked in like he always did. Quiet. Steady. Worn boots tapping soft on the cracked tile floor of Rusty Joe's Cafe. A place that used to be his, back when jukeboxes meant something and a handshake was as good as a promise. Edward Moore, 85 years old, a retired Navy chief with steel in his spine and time carved deep into the lines of his face, nodded once to the bartender and took his usual seat. No fanfare, just a black coffee and a moment of peace. But peace doesn't last long in a world that forgets who built it. The door creaked open and 3 men walked in, leather vests, loud boots, cheap laughter. You could smell the gas fumes and ego before they hit the counter. One of them, big arms, bigger mouth, locked eyes on Edward and smirked. "Look at this tough old fossil," he said loud enough for everyone to hear. Still pretending he's someone? Edward didn't flinch, didn't blink. He lifted his cup. That seemed to bother the man more than any insult. "I'm talking to you, old man," the biker said, stepping closer, voice sharper now. No reply, just the steady hand of a man who's seen real fear and knows this ain't it. Then it happened. The biker knocked the cup from his hands. It shattered on the ground. And right there, in the middle of a dead silent room, the punch came, a hard right to Edward's face. His chair toppled. His body fell. And still, no one moved. No one spoke. Not a soul. But Edward did what real men do when the odds stack up and the crowd stays silent. He reached into his coat, pulled out a phone, and with fingers that trembled from age, not fear, he dialed one number. Just one. "Nate," he said, calm as still water. "I need you. You're watching Cracks of Light, where real stories burn brighter than fiction. If that moment gripped you, hit like, leave a comment, and subscribe for more true tales that punch through the darkness." Now let's go back to where it all began. Rusty Joe's Cafe wasn't much anymore. Paint chipped from the walls. Coffee always burnt. But for Edward, it wasn't about the drink. It was ritual, routine, a grounding place where the past could breathe for a minute. Every Wednesday, same time, same seat. That's how people like Edward move through a world that barely notices them anymore, quietly, without complaint. Most of the regulars didn't know who he was. They saw an old man in a worn cap that said U.S. Navy and assumed he'd faded like the flag over the diner window. But inside that silence, Edward held decades of storms, of brothers lost, of orders given in the dead of night when seconds meant lives. He wasn't there to boast. He was just drinking his coffee. That's when the bikers walked in. That's when respect died, right there in front of a dozen people too afraid to stand, or maybe too numb to care. And that's when something far older, far stronger, woke up inside a man who never stopped serving. At Fort Harper, Major Nathan Moore was in the middle of a live training debrief with his team when an encrypted line buzzed. He never answered his phone during operations, not unless it was urgent. He saw the caller ID. "One word, Dad." He stopped speaking mid-sentence. His voice tightened. "Hold position," he told his second-in-command and stepped outside. The hallway was sterile, bright, quiet. He answered, "Dad." A pause. Then the calm, even voice of Edward Moore. "I need you to come. Now." No explanation. No emotion. Just the weight behind the words. Nathan had heard that tone before, once on a battlefield. It meant something was wrong. Dead wrong. Within 4 minutes, he had rerouted his unit's transport protocol and activated a contingency rarely used, protective mobilization in support of a decorated veteran. The destination? A small cafe, off-state Route 67. Meanwhile, back in Rusty Joe's, the laughter was louder. Travis leaned back in his chair, arms behind his head, grinning like a man who thought he'd won something. "Bet he's calling the nursing home," he joked to his crew. "Or maybe the History Museum wants their mummy back." One of them chuckled through a mouthful of fries. Nobody else laughed. Not the waitress who stood frozen by the kitchen door. Not the bartender who kept wiping the same glass, eyes down. Not the college kid in the corner pretending to scroll his phone, quietly angling it toward the table. The camera app had been recording for 2 minutes now. "Whole town's gone soft," Travis continued, flicking a toothpick onto the floor. "Old guys think they still matter." "What's he gonna do?" Write a letter? His voice cut through the silence, loud, ugly, heavy with contempt. Still, no one said anything. Just like before. The old man sat there with a red mark on his cheek, hands folded, unmoving. Waiting. 30 miles away, 6 men in civilian clothes, all former special operations, piled into 2 matte black SUVs. Nathan was already inside, checking coordinates, briefing his team. Target is civilian. My father. He was assaulted in public. Objective, secure, de-escalate, and confirm facts. Use no force unless required. And keep your damn tempers in check. The men nodded once. That's all they needed. Within seconds, the convoy was on the road, moving at tactical speed. Inside the cafe, time ticked. The tension didn't break. It calcified, and somewhere in the middle of it, Edward Moore blinked once, slowly. He knew what was coming. And more importantly, so did his enemies. They just didn't know it yet. The sound hit first. Not music, not chatter, not thunder. It was deeper than that. Low, rhythmic, unyielding. A hum that turned into a growl. Then the screech of tires as 2 matte black SUVs and 1 unmarked tactical vehicle came to a stop in front of Rusty Joe's cafe. No sirens. No flashing lights. Just precision. Just silence. Doors opened at once. 6 men stepped out in quiet formation, all in plain clothes, but no one mistook what they were. The weight of military discipline clung to them like second skin. Nathan Moore emerged last. He wasn't carrying a weapon. He didn't need to. His stance alone made the air shift. Clean-cut, stone-faced, his eyes scanning the building like he was breaching hostile ground. He pushed the door open and stepped inside. The bar went silent. No one moved. Travis looked up, grinned, leaned back like he was expecting to be entertained. Well, you must be the cavalry. Nathan didn't answer. His eyes didn't flinch. They swept the room, landed on his father. Edward sat straight, his expression unreadable, the bruise under his eye darkening by the second. Nathan's voice was cold. Which one? Edward raised a single finger. Nothing more. That was enough. Nathan stepped forward. He didn't raise his voice. Didn't threaten. Just reached into his jacket and pulled out a small black tablet. One tap. The screen lit up, and he turned it to face the room. A security camera angle. Grainy but clear. The old man sitting peacefully. The bikers entering. The words. The slap of the coffee cup. The punch. Edward hitting the floor. The footage froze at that moment. Fist still extended, Edward mid-fall. Gasps. A woman near the bar covered her mouth. The silence that followed was louder than any scream. Nathan stared straight at Travis. Still feel like a tough guy, he said flatly. Travis's smirk faltered. He glanced at the tablet, at the screen, then at the 6 men now positioned quietly along the room's exits. One near the front door, one beside the bartender, the rest forming a perimeter, calm, watching. No weapons drawn, no orders given, but their presence screamed control. Travis laughed, though it sounded thin. Man, I didn't know he was your old man. I was just messing around. No harm meant. Nathan's eyes didn't move. You didn't care who he was. That's the problem. Behind the counter, the bar manager stepped forward, hands raised. Hey, look, Colonel Major, Nathan corrected, his tone still even. Right, Major. No one wants trouble here. We didn't know it would go this far. Nathan didn't look away from Travis. It went this far the moment a war hero got punched and nobody said a damn word. His voice wasn't loud, but it cut through every corner of the room. Then came the final blow. The district attorney already has the footage. Charges are being filed. Assault on a decorated veteran. Witnesses present. Felony. And I'm sure the press will be very interested. Travis stood up, slower now. His bravado drained. He opened his mouth again, but before he could say a word, the front door opened. 2 sheriff's deputies stepped in, one holding a printout. They walked straight over, said nothing, and cuffed Travis without ceremony. He didn't resist. The room stayed frozen. Every chair felt heavier. Every breath, careful. Nathan turned to the rest of the cafe, scanning the faces. Every one of you saw it happen, he said. And not a single one of you stood up. Not one. Eyes dropped. No one replied. He walked over to Edward, placed a firm hand on his shoulder. You okay, sir? Edward looked up, voice quiet. Took worse in Saigon. He didn't smile. Nathan nodded once. Then let's remind them who you are. Travis stood with his wrists locked in metal, the weight of the cuffs finally registering in his posture. But the arrogance hadn't drained all the way yet. I mean, it wasn't that serious, he muttered, shrugging like a child caught breaking a window. I didn't know who he was. I was just screwing around. Nathan's eyes didn't blink. He didn't lean in, didn't raise his voice. He just stared until the air in the room went cold. So, if he wasn't a veteran, it would have been okay. Travis opened his mouth again, but had no answer. Nathan took a step closer, his voice low and calm. This isn't about rank or medals. It's about dignity, about right and wrong. That man was sitting quietly, minding his own business. And you assaulted him in front of a room full of witnesses who did nothing. Then you laughed. He turned to the sheriff, standing beside him. You saw the footage. You tell me what part of that looks like a joke. The sheriff didn't say a word. He just pressed play again. The video on the tablet lit up. The grainy footage rolled. Edward sipping his coffee, the bikers entering, the mocking, the cup knocked from his hands, the punch, the fall. The audio was fuzzy, but the body language told the whole story. No resistance. No provocation. Just an old man getting hit in front of a dozen people who froze. The punch played again in slow motion. When it ended, the sheriff turned to his deputy and said flatly, "Book him. Aggravated assault on a decorated veteran. Civilian witnesses. Upload that footage for the DA." The deputy grabbed Travis's arm and pulled him toward the door. This time, Travis didn't smirk. He didn't fight. He just lowered his head and walked. But Nathan wasn't done. He turned back to the room, slowly scanning every face. No one made eye contact. You all saw it. He said, voice louder now, not angry but clear. You saw him walk in. You saw that man knock a cup from his hands. You saw him get hit. And not when you stood up. Not one. A woman near the back clutched her purse tighter. The bartender looked down at the sink. Nathan stepped forward again, now speaking to the whole place like he was giving a mission briefing. It didn't take courage to punch an old man. That wasn't strength. That was cowardice. But it took even less to sit and say nothing while it happened. He looked to his father. Edward sat still, his hands folded, eyes fixed on the floor. The bruise on his cheek had spread. His lip was split, but not bleeding anymore. He hadn't said a word since Nathan entered. He didn't need to. Nathan turned back to the others. My father didn't call me because he wanted revenge. He didn't want backup. He wanted someone to witness the truth. Someone to stand where no one else would. His voice dropped. Because silence, in a place like this, is worse than the punch. A man near the dartboard finally spoke, voice dry. We didn't know what to do. Nathan's response was quick. That's not an excuse. You don't need a badge or a uniform to say, that's enough. You don't need training to stop a wrong. Another man, older, nodded faintly but said nothing. Nathan walked to the center of the room. I grew up being told this place, this town, stood for something. That neighbors looked out for each other. That a man like my father could sit here and be known, not ignored. Instead, today you all made this place smaller. No one argued. No one defended themselves. Some looked ashamed. Some just looked empty. Nathan took a breath, steadied himself. He's not just a veteran. He's a husband, a father, a citizen. And every one of you chose to forget that the second it got uncomfortable. He pointed toward the door, where Travis had just been taken. That guy. He's not the whole problem. The problem is when everyone else acts like it's none of their business. He walked back to his father, knelt beside him. You okay? Edward looked at him. His voice was quiet. I've taken worse. But it wasn't the punch that hurt. He looked up at the room, eyes steady. It was the silence that came after it. Nathan stood and faced them all once more. I didn't come here to cause a scene. I came here to remind you of something you've clearly forgotten. This town wasn't built by people who kept their heads down when wrong things happened. And if that's who we're becoming, then maybe it's not just one man who needs to be held accountable. Maybe it's all of us. He didn't wait for applause. He didn't ask for permission. He let the silence answer for itself. And for the first time since it all began, that silence actually meant something. Edward Moore sat quietly as the room absorbed the weight of his son's words. He didn't move right away, didn't rush to speak. When he did, his voice was low, raspy, but clear enough to silence the last few murmurs. "I enlisted when I was 17, he said. "I didn't do it to be a hero. I did it because I believed in something bigger than myself." No one interrupted. "I spent 30 years in uniform. Saw places most of you wouldn't want to read about. Lost friends whose names you'll never know. And when I came home, I did what most of us did. I shut up, got a job, and kept going. Because that's what service looks like when it's over. You fade out, so the rest of the world can move on." He looked down at his hands. "And most days, that's fine. You don't expect applause. You just hope you won't be forgotten completely." He looked around the room, his gaze locking eyes with a man near the bar who couldn't hold it. "But today reminded me what that fading out costs." A long pause. "It's not the punch I'll remember. It's watching a room full of people I used to believe and pretend it didn't happen." A woman near the back put her hand over her mouth, tears streaking her face. Someone whispered, "I'm sorry." Another man said it louder. "We're sorry, sir." Edward didn't nod. He didn't dismiss them. He just said, "Don't be sorry for me. Be better for the next one." The sheriff stepped forward then, his voice level. "We'll process this right. No shortcuts. The DA will see the full video, and we'll follow through. That's a promise." Nathan turned to face them all again. "My father fought for the right of people to live without fear. That doesn't mean you had to throw a punch or wear a uniform. But someone, just one of you, could have stood up, could have said something." He took a step forward. "No one's asking you to fight battles you're not trained for. We're asking you to recognize one when it's standing in front of you." His tone didn't change, but the sting in it was unmistakable. Because silence isn't neutral. It chooses a side. And today it didn't choose right. Someone in the far corner stood up. A young man, no older than 20. "Can I shake your hand, sir?" he said, voice cracking. Edward gave the faintest nod. The boy crossed the room. When their hands met, the room seemed to shift. Another person followed, then another. And soon, the man who had walked in alone to drink a quiet cup of coffee was surrounded. Not by pity, not by spectacle, but by a line of people who suddenly remembered what respect really looked like. Nathan stood at the edge, arms folded, watching. His father didn't need defending. He never had. What he needed, what he'd always needed, was for people to finally see him. And this time they did. 2 weeks after the incident, Rusty Joe's Cafe wasn't just renovated. It had been transformed. Not in some flashy commercial way, but in a way that said someone had finally started paying attention. The chipped paint was gone, the broken jukebox fixed, but none of that was what people noticed first. What stood out was the new memorial display set up in the center of the main wall, right where the old neon beer sign used to hang. It wasn't loud, it wasn't showy, but it demanded respect. Inside a glass case was a folded American flag, the kind handed to widows and fathers at military funerals, except this one was given to Edward Moore when he retired from active duty after more than 30 years in the Navy. Next to it sat a black and white portrait of him in uniform, eyes forward, medals across his chest, the same eyes that had stared down a man half his age without flinching. There were medals, 3 rows of them, including the Navy Cross, the Silver Star, and the National Defense Service Medal. There was also a single frame containing a letter of commendation from the Secretary of the Navy, dated during the Vietnam War, and a small bronze plaque at the bottom. Sergeant Edward Moore, U.S. Navy, Ret. Defender of Freedom. Witness to silence. Reminder of what we owe. Nobody made an announcement. Nobody called the press. It just appeared one morning, built and installed by a few regulars. One a retired Army mechanic, another a former Navy cook, both of whom hadn't spoken much to each other in years. But they'd both been there that day. They saw what happened, and they saw what they didn't do. The case stood as both tribute and apology. That same week, for the first time in more than a decade, a meeting of local veterans quietly took place in the back corner of the cafe. Some came in alone, some with wives who had encouraged them, but when they sat down at that long wooden table, they didn't talk about war. Not right away. They just sat there, ordered coffee, and looked around the room like it was the first time they'd seen it clearly. One of them, a man in his late 70s named Carl, finally broke the silence by saying, "I thought we stopped matching." Edward, seated across from him, didn't say anything at first. Then he replied, "We didn't. We just let the noise drown us out. That started something. By the end of the week, a small flyer went up on the corkboard near the cafe's front door. Veterans Roundtable. Every Thursday, 9 a.m. All ages welcome. Listening ears required. What no one expected was the next Thursday. A group of high school seniors showed up. They didn't say much at first, just ordered coffees and sat in the booths nearby. One girl quietly asked if she could join the veterans table. She said her grandfather had served but died before she got to ask him what it was really like. Edward pulled out a chair without a word. She sat. Then another student did. Then a boy who looked nervous but didn't want to be left out. Over time, questions came. Not forced, not rehearsed. Real ones. Did you ever think you wouldn't make it home? What do you miss most about those days? Were you scared when you got back? The old men answered. Some with stories. Some with just looks. But they answered. Word spread fast through the small town. Teachers began suggesting students spend time at the cafe as part of community credit. Parents started stopping by just to see what all the quiet buzz was about. Nobody called a program. It wasn't a movement. It was just one man's story making space for others. And through it all, Edward Moore kept coming back. Same seat, same coffee. Sometimes Nathan joined him when he could get away from the base. Other times, Edward sat alone, but never really alone anymore. Every day someone new stopped by to shake his hand or say thank you. Some days they said nothing at all, just a nod. That was enough. One Friday morning, two young men who used to hang around with Travis came in. They didn't make a scene. They just walked up to the case, stood there for a long moment, and then left without ordering. One of them left behind a small envelope addressed simply for the old man. Inside was a short note, handwritten and shaky. I didn't stop it. I didn't swing either. But I saw it. I saw what he did, and I saw how he didn't even need to lift a finger to win. I hope someday I'm that kind of man. Edward never told anyone what the note said, but he kept it folded in his wallet after that. Rusty Joe's didn't become a museum. It stayed a cafe. People still came in for eggs and black coffee, the same bad biscuits, the same corner table with worn-down wood. But something in the place had shifted. Respect didn't hang in the air because someone demanded it. It lived there now because someone had reminded the room what it meant to deserve it. Edward Moore didn't ask to be honored. But the moment that cafe chose to do it anyway, something broken began to knit itself back together. Not with speeches, but with presence. With the understanding that some moments, when witnessed properly, have the power to rewrite a community's memory. And this one had. Edward Moore sat beside his son just outside the cafe, the late summer sun dropping low behind the trees, casting a quiet amber light that felt heavier than the heat itself. Neither of them spoke for a while. They didn't need to. Down the road, a group of high school students were placing miniature American flags along the curb. One every 10 feet, carefully, respectfully, like they understood what the act meant even if they couldn't yet explain why. Edward watched them without comment, hands resting on his knees, his gaze steady. Nathan glanced over, then back at the street. You know you didn't ask for justice, he said quietly. But you lived in a way that made people realize it mattered again. Edward didn't respond right away. Then, almost like an afterthought, he said, sometimes you don't fight by swinging. Sometimes you just stay standing. That evening, when Edward got up to leave, he paused at the door of Rusty Joe's, the same door he'd walked through 100 times before. But this time, something was different. The chatter stopped. The clinking of cups ceased. Slowly, every person in the cafe stood. No one spoke. No music played. And one by one, they each placed a hand over their heart. There were no speeches, no signs, no stage tributes. Just the kind of silence that doesn't hide shame, but carries weight. A silence that honors. Edward froze for just a moment, visibly taken off guard. Then he nodded once, eyes scanning the room, and stepped out into the fading light. Nathan followed, quietly, matching his father's stride. Neither looked back. Some stories end with fanfare, some with punishment, but the ones that last, really last, end with change. What happened in that small cafe wasn't just about a punch or a moment of silence. It was about what we allow, what we ignore, and who we choose to become when the test finally comes. Edward Moore didn't raise his voice. He didn't lift a hand. But he reminded a whole town what integrity looks like. And that was enough to make them remember who they were. If this story moved you, let us know in the comments. Share it with someone who needs to hear it. And if you believe in honoring the quiet heroes among us, hit that like button and subscribe to Cracks of Light, where real stories reveal the courage that never fades.